Welcome back to the Learning Military channel. The last episode saw us begin our analysis of what a war with Iran would look like using over 25 sources ranging from government publications, academic research, Wargames, interviews, and other credible sources. We discussed how easily things would escalate, how Iran would use proxies and cyber attacks, the closing of the Strait of Hormuz, the air campaign, a shortage of smart weapons for the United States, the use of Iranian cruise and ballistic missiles, as well as a number of other topics. So if you haven't watched the previous episode, I recommend going back and watching it so you can see how this full scenario plays out, because in this episode, we'll discuss and go through what experts say would ensue in a ground campaign and occupation. Before I get into it though, if you can support me on Patreon to help support this channel and the research that I do, that's a great way to be able to do it. Thank you to all my patrons for supporting me so far. You can also support this channel by subscribing if you haven't already and hit the bell icon to be notified when future episodes come out. You can also share this video with those that you like, hit the thumbs up button, and comment and let me know something that you learned. That information is helpful to know how to make videos like this in the future. Now, let's get on to the ground campaign. Out of all the research that I did, this was the hardest information to obtain. Wargames and plans obviously exist for how to invade Iran, but that information is understandably classified. After all, we don't want to telegraph what we will do and when we will do it, but there's still a lot of relevant information that is available. For example, we know what challenges an invasion force will have and what it will take to be successful. So if you've made it this far, please continue to stay with me throughout the rest of this video. While we have focused up to this point on the Air Force and the Navy, that's not to say that the Army has been out of the picture. In this scenario, the Army has been sending some soldiers to the area, likely to Saudi Arabia, with Patriot missile batteries, HIMARS, and attack helicopters. Obviously, a much larger ground force is going to be needed than what the Army currently has in this scenario. One issue I think the military would press for would be to have the right size force to invade Iran. One article I found argued that the 250,000 forces the Pentagon got in 2003 to invade Iraq was not enough, that 500,000 was what was really needed, especially for the occupation. So when you consider that Iran is twice the size and population of Iraq, and that the total landmass is about the size of the entirety of Western Europe, we're going to need a lot more forces than the 120,000 that has been floated around, or even the 250,000 that was used in Iraq. The number of forces needed to successfully invade Iran was laid out in an article on thinkprogress.org by Gil Barndollar, Director of Middle East Studies at the Center of the National Interest. He served in the U.S. Marine Corps as an infantry officer, and this is what he wrote on the topic. He argues that the 600,000 service members that comprise the active duty forces of the U.S. Army and Marine Corps are not enough to invade Iran. Even with the mobilization of the entire National Guard and reserves, he still would not be comfortable invading Iran. He argued that to have the appropriately sized force, we would need to have a national draft. And that's a lot to ask for, but having a force that size has its own problems. For example, where are we going to base them? Now, this is a big problem. There is nowhere in the Middle East right now that we could base them. The logical thought would be trying to base our forces near the location where they will invade from, like a neighboring country. So what direction are we going to invade from? There are two problems. Stratfor, a private intelligence firm, describes the first. They say that Iran is a fortress, surrounded on three sides by mountains and on the fourth by the ocean. There is not an easy way into Iran at any point. There is one small area that you might notice on the southwestern border that Saddam Hussein tried to use in the Iraq-Iran war, but he quickly found out that the area is comprised of a lot of swamps and was easily defendable, so even that is a no-go. The other problem is the fact that there is no one on the border of Iran who would be willing to or could even host such a large force. Iran is bordered by Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Turkmenistan. Most of those countries have either outright expressed that they would refuse to let anyone invade Iran through their territory, or they are located in an area where it makes basing our forces there impossible. Some countries are landlocked and would require us to supply our forces through Russia, who I would assume surely will refuse to allow us to use their territory for invading Iran. Others, well, let's just say we aren't on good terms with them right now, so that's just going to be out of the question. What the national interest suggests, and what I found to be the most common proposal, is an amphibious landing along the southern coastline. This is what we will use for this scenario. Since we know that the US will be coming in from the south, the most likely choice for basing will be Saudi Arabia. And even here, there is conflicting information from what I found. While the national interest suggests that the willingness of the Saudis to sponsor a long-term campaign against Iran is in question, they also state that some of the U.S. allies in the Middle East won't worry too much about the prospect of committing the United States to an open-ended military conflict with Iran. Saudi Arabia may very well be one of those countries. Well, let's say that the Saudis were willing to base the Americans. Gil Barndollar said that in an ideal situation, with no ballistic missiles, no chemical or biological attacks, it still would take months to mobilize and stage the required forces necessary to invade Iran. This would allow Iran to build up its defenses and raise more troops. Barndollar continued to say that the Navy would be hard-pressed to muster enough amphibious assault ships to get even one Marine Expeditionary Brigade to the fight with only about 15,000 troops. And this would mean that merchant marine ships would have to bring in the bulk of the force. These ships will likely have to face several challenges getting the forces ashore. They will find themselves likely under the threat of attack by Iranian mini-subs, as well as anti-ship missiles, cruise and ballistic missiles, fast attack boats, mines, and anything else that we might have missed too. The force concentration required to pull off such a landing force would pose too great an opportunity to pass up for Iran, and they would throw anything that it could at that force. Again, hoping to score a major PR victory here. Needless to say, as the Marines and other forces tried to establish a beachhead, casualties would be high. If Iran hadn't employed chemical, biological, or dirty bombs up to this point, this would be one of the more likely times for them to do so. Remember when I said that the most likely route into Iran would come along the southern coast? Iran has thought the same thing and has been preparing for an attack like this one for over 25 years. Here's what our forces would likely be up against. Keep in mind, some of these numbers would likely change due to the air campaign and Iran immobilization, but needless to say, this is a sizable force. And this is what has been reported to Congress as what the Iranian military has right now. With a beachhead established, more challenges await. The Iranian terrain is mountainous and heavily favors the defender. A quick run towards Tehran would be far more difficult to pull off than it would be getting to Baghdad in Iraq. Here's a topography comparison of Iraq and Iran. Keep in mind that the next image of Iran is reflecting a larger scale. Iraq is showing the color white to represent anything higher than 2,000 meters. You can see there is very little of that in Iraq. And this one of Iran, it is showing white for anything above 3,000 meters. You can see that Iran has a lot of mountains that will cause problems for the troops moving inland. Tehran is here towards the north of the country, so to be able to get to this critically important objective, look at all the terrain and mountains that our forces are going to have to go through. Getting to Tehran would be a formidable task. Throughout the advance, the IRGC and other Iranian forces would be implementing what they call the mosaic defense. Essentially, these forces would be taking advantage of the terrain and mountains as a guerrilla campaign would start to form wherever possible. As supply lines would become stretched out and other areas are made vulnerable, stay-behind cells and others would do all that they could to harass the Americans. The main force that would oppose the US would be a mix of armored, infantry, and mechanized units, but a lot of these forces would remain close to cities and other urban environments, with the hope of drawing American forces into these cities where air support would be more difficult, where mobility would be severely limited, and where the guerrilla forces could blend in with the civilian populace. This is something that Iran has trained for extensively. Caitlin Talmadge at Georgetown University brought up another point regarding the land invasion that I feel is pretty significant. And that is, when you look at the Iran-Iraq war in the 80s, Iran showed a significantly high level of cost tolerance, meaning that they were willing to accept high casualties in the name of victory. This would likely be the case in our scenario as well, meaning that each battle would be hard fought. You wouldn't see soldiers surrendering en masse like in Iraq, especially at the outset of the invasion. The ground invasion would be hard won, with significantly more casualties than Iraq and taking far more time and more money spent to do so. At the end of the ground campaign, an occupation would start that would likely persist into another forever war, unless the IRGC cuts force and others are annihilated, something that will likely not happen during the ground campaign. Joe Carl wrote in an article for the Modern War Institute about what an occupation of Iran would be like. He built on what Dr. David Edelstein said was the 3 things that are needed to be able to successfully occupy another country. In his words, he says, first, the occupied population must recognize the need to be occupied. Second, the occupier and the occupied must mutually recognize a common threat to the occupied territory. And finally, there must be a credible belief among the occupied that the occupier will withdraw and return control of the territory to an indigenous government promptly. Now, Carl relates this to Iran, and this is what he says. He says, if we apply Edelstein's 3 factors to the occupation of Iran, it indicates the United States would likely fail. First, most Iranians don't see any need to be occupied by a foreign force. Second, the occupied population of Iran would not share a mutual threat with the United States. Today, Iran's biggest rivals are Saudi Arabia and Israel. Both are close U.S. allies. Finally, historical precedents would signal to the Iranians that the United States could make no credible guarantee to leave promptly. And Carl is right here. When you look at Iraq and Afghanistan and how those occupations go, Iranians would have very little belief that we would leave promptly. Now, he later calls an occupation of Iran a near impossible task, and we would likely discover that fact should we develop plans for such an occupation. Okay, so there you have it. This is our scenario. Now let me be clear about this. As long as the civilian population here in the United States is supportive of war, the US will be able to defeat Iran. But I think that to be able to do it, a victory would be much more bloody and lengthy than I think what most people would expect. I hope that's one of the things that you got out of this. I hear people who don't know as much about Iran or a military, far less than you know now, who are calling for war, not knowing what it will take or what it will cost. Even if things go way better than how this scenario is planned out, such a conflict will make it very difficult for us to be able to do other things like to deter Russia and China, and we may pay the price for this conflict in other ways across the world. So I hope this laid out what a war with Iran could look like, but I hope you enjoyed it and you learned something. I could have made this a lot longer. I didn't talk about what would happen on the international scale, trying to build a coalition, what Russia and China would be doing throughout all of this to maybe make it more difficult for us to invade Iran. But comment below and tell me something that you learned or what else you think might be helpful to this conversation. I really appreciate you sticking with me throughout this entire video. This was absolutely amazing for me to make, and I'm looking forward to making more videos like this on the Learning Military channel in the future. So if you haven't subscribed and hit the bell icon, please do so, because I think you'll like some of the other videos that I have planned. I think the next one will be looking at the Space Force. What it is, why we need it, should be good, so come back for that. Like the video if something in here was good, and again, if you are able to help support me, the work that I do here on this channel, or my education, please consider becoming a patron in the description below. By the way, you'll also find a link to a Discord. I have another YouTube channel, so both the Patreon and the Discord are kind of a hybrid between both channels, but you're welcome to join the Discord as well and join in conversations about the military and things like that we have there as a community. So thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. As always, I've got your 6.